welcome to Sense Space. Today I'm delighted to offer a one-of-a-kind dialogue on the book Atlas Shrugged with the one and only Bethany Tabor, and Mr. O.G. Rose Daniel Ghana is in the house. We have two premier philosophers, two people who could talk about this book for about 10 hours if we let them loose. But we're not going to do that. We're going to be concise and hopefully insightful in our explorations. And I know these guys have a lot of reflections to offer. A little bit of background how this came together. Bethany started a Twitter Spaces reading club on the book. She's very passionate about it, and her passion provoked my curiosity to check out this book and see what it was about. And I have not been let down by that curiosity. This text to me has been, I've really been seeing it as somehow alongside George Orwell's 1984 as a really important and relevant diagnosis of totalitarianism and decline and the necessity of truthful speech, and conscience. And in some ways more relevant to our time than 1984. Although 1984 is often waved about as, you know, the only lens through which to see our time, just as Hitler is the only dictator to look to. So this book's really rich. It's really important. And I'm hoping that we can lay out a little bit of why it offers such a profound diagnosis of our moment. And I've certainly noticed that through the reading of the book, I've become more aware, and certain aspects of decline and cultural shift have become more salient to me. So with that, I want to invite Bethany just to share a little bit about the context of this book, what it's meant to you. In particular, I'm interested about Ayn Rand's background as coming from the Soviet Union to America. And of course, this book was written in the 1950s and we're in 2023, but there's a profound time wave resonance right now where the book seems to speak to our moment. So yeah, with that, pass it over to Bethany and Daniel and we'll go from there.
Hi. Yeah, Jacob, thanks for having me. And appreciate the introduction with my middle name. Yeah, just before I directly answer your question or your prompt, I think that it was interesting that that you have a resonance with 1984 in this book. The reason why I think it's interesting is because George Orwell is sort of thinking about, okay, what are at the time of writing 1984, he's thinking what are policies being put in place in the present and how is that going to look in decades into the future? And so he sets his novel in the future and is is kind of watch out, this is the destiny that we're heading toward. Whereas Ayn Rand is, I don't think that she would appreciate being called a mystic fortune teller, even though she was very prescient. But she's famously anti-mystic. So, but she saw the writing on the wall. She was so clearly a first principles thinker, and she could see what was coming down the pike in decades from her time, but she decides to set her novel in the present. Or, I mean, she doesn't explicitly say that it's sci-fi. A lot of people do think that it's like sci-fi, but she never explicitly says that. It's never stated as explicitly as George Orwell is. And so it's just, it feels that key difference gives 1984 and Atlas Shrugged very distinctive vibes, because Atlas Shrugged feels very threatening, I guess. The way that society is collapsing feels very threatening because you feel like it's happening now. And I think that when I think about 1984, I still have that mindset in my head where I'm like, oh, this is still kind of in the future. What if we have these thought police in the future? But we already do. And so Atlas Shrugged is the efficacy of Atlas Shrugged is just so much more, because it's just oh, this is the world that we're living in. This we are living through the collapses that Ayn Rand totally saw coming because of her first principles thought. But but also that is informed by, now to directly answer your prompt, this is informed by her life growing up in the Soviet Union. She was born in 1905, I think, 1902, 1905. And her father had, I believe, a drugstore above their home in Russia. And yeah, with the Bolshevik Revolution, saw that any kind of like entrepreneurial business or like life-sustaining business, she saw that collapse. So this also informs her first principles thinking, is the fact that she lived through this Bolshevik Revolution where these socialist or communistic ideals were imposed upon her family and caused her family great harm. And she came to America when she was 20 or 21 and forged her life for herself out here. And I think that it's interesting. The Francisco character, it's funny, I see the second time that I read it, and parts of when I read it a third time, that makes me sound insane. So that makes me sound like I'm an insane woman. But I see little bits of her in Francisco and I see bits of like her projection. She kept her accent. Russian accent was very thick throughout her life, even though she's clearly a master of the English language when you read her prose. But she like talks about Francisco as having like a he like can speak perfect English and perfect American accent. And I feel like that's a little bit of her projection. Francisco has such an ideal vision of America, and he's so inspired by America and so inspired by the fact that it was this country built on reason and thought and philosophy. And so yeah, you really see her gratitude toward her immigration coming through with Francisco, which I think is really nice also. And also that's why she feels so threatened by the fact that like the American ideal, and in some ways the capitalist ideal, in some ways this exceptional individualist ideal, it's a threat to her very soul. I think that really, really comes through. And a threat to life, which is a big point for Daniel, which I'd like to kick it over to you to talk about that more.
I want to rush in right now, out of character, and quickly add one or two things that came up for me when Bethany was speaking. Just the first, as relates to 1984 and Atlas Shrugged, is in 1984, it seems much more like there's a domineering ideology which has taken hold and imposed on society. And this is a lot more the kind of totalitarian vision that we seem to fear in present time. But in Atlas Shrugged, it's more like a deconstruction, a nihilism, a postmodern giving way of truth. And then there's this really important realization detailed intricately throughout the book, from like the bottom up of how the railroads are functioning to whether the guys who do the signaling show up for work and how they feel, is that the actual idea, the attitude, the spirit of the age, the relationship to truth and philosophy has profoundly practical implications and gives way to the breakdown of the material infrastructure at every level. And this is the thing that I'm beginning to become more and more curious if this is actually occurring in our society right now, as I witness all these instances of infrastructure not really functioning, is like whether there's something going on at the spirit of the time, at the relationship to values, that is actually meaningfully shaping our material reality and so on. So thank you for that.
Well said.
Interruption.
Not an interruption at all. Beautifully put. One of the ways I think we can think of Miss Rand, and first off, how many people write a book like that, let alone in their non-native tongue, and all the work that they put into that is extraordinary. I think one of the keys to thinking about her thought is a world where value always equals value. For her, she loves Aristotle. She talks about Aristotle all the time. And we know about virtue ethics, but another way to think about virtue is value ethics. You know, people talk about these different things and how they go together. And the question is the following: is there a way to have value morally connect with value creation socially? And for her, the only possible of a good society is one that does this. And anything that disconnects between moral value and economic value is very, very dangerous. And so all the characters are constantly avoiding temptations to speak to the side or slanted. There's always these contrasts between, say, when Dagny is talking with, I believe it's Lillian, Miss Reardon. Miss Reardon is always saying, well, you know what I'm getting at. You know what I'm saying. And she's like, no, I don't. No, I don't. Always these resistance of indirect speech, of generalities, of supposings, because those are the sort of ways of speaking that gradually drift us in a direction that pulls apart the necessary connection between value and value, moral value and economic value. And what Miss Rand is proposing is that if that disconnection occurs, all bets are off. No one will be able to tell up from down. It's basically, in a way, for her, it's kind of the death of God. As we know from the madman parable, it's when the sun is unchained from the earth, when up is down, left is right. And what will we do now? You're completely disorganized. It's not clear what is good and what is bad. And she understands that anything that's not straight to maintaining that is at risk of causing the drift. One of the reasons why a book like 1984 is actually problematic is because it doesn't have to convince you it's bad. No vision of totalitarianism is a very useful description that anyone can read and say, oh, I know this is bad. Because that's never going to be how the world falls apart, because everyone will know as it occurs. Actually, in a way, 1984 can pose a big problem because people are like, oh, we know what tyranny looks like. We'll recognize it when we see it, so we'll always stop it. It creates an overconfidence. Something similar can occur with Huxley. Pleasure is bad. We know pleasure can control well. People are using their TikTok all the time. We know that's bad, so we stop it. So there's a way. Now, I'm not saying Orwell and Huxley are bad, but there's actually a danger in only having narratives of how the world falls apart that are self-evidently bad. The way the world falls apart has to seem like a good idea at the time. Otherwise, it won't fall apart because people will stop it before it gets there. What Ayn Rand is asking the question is, how does a world slip into deconstruction? If you ask any kid on the street, is it good for deconstruction to occur? They say absolutely not. The problem with life is that it is not always self-evident what are the things that are going to lead to your deconstruction. In fact, a lot of things that seem good can end up being bad and contributing to the problem. In fact, you could argue the original title of the book is The Strike. What is Dagny doing the entire time? She's confusing the right thing with the wrong thing because you're maintaining the source, the vitality of the looters that destroys the world. So you see in Dagny the mistake of confusing right and wrong, right? The thinking that something is right or a good thing, that is the only way the world is ever going to really end up in the worst situations. Because otherwise the majority of people won't go along with them, of course, right? So the reason why Atlas Shrugged is so useful is because it offers you a blueprint of the gradual slippage into a world that's falling apart. Not an automatic Big Brother's here, and then later on we'll read about the war with Oceania and the perpetual war and different things. With Brave New World, Soma's here. We're already controlled by pleasure, and it's not really showing us how we end up there. There are books like We, where everything's made of glass. That was actually an inspiration for Orwell, an earlier Russian novel. Well, we know that's bad. We know the surveillance state is bad. So if we see that, we'll stop it. But the problem is that makes us perhaps overconfident. A book like Atlas Shrugged can show you how what we think is good and moral and virtuous can actually be in service of the engine. That's the metaphor of the whole book is the engine and the motor that leads to doom. And I think the critical thing, and then I'll pass it on, the critical thing to understand about Ayn Rand is this is the defense of life, the love of life. It is not a defense of, say, making a lot of money. A lot of people say that. For her, in a world where money equals virtue, making a lot of money is making a lot of virtue. Is it not a virtue to create a toothbrush that can help people from having their teeth rot? Is it not a virtue to make a train that people can travel to see their family in? Is it not a virtue to make a world where food is accessible? How are these things not virtues? And yet somehow in our minds, material things are not virtuous. Arguably, there's no other form of virtue that anyone cares about. And so for her, the question is, how can you maintain the value of the economy aligned with the value of ethics? Because that's when you maintain life. That's where life can grow. In the famous money speech, to Bethany's point, Francisco, who says he loves America, he says one of the reasons he loves America so much is because the first time in human history, the phrase make money came into existence. And for him, since money equals the connection of value with value, that means increase in a non-zero sum game, the amount of value and virtue that exists in the world. And it's the first civilization that believes in the possibility that value and virtue is not a zero sum game, but a non-zero sum game. And there is no necessary limit, almost in a David Deutsch sense, of the kind of value and virtue that can exist. But a country has to be erected in vision of that and believe in it and fight for it and not let the separation between virtue and virtue, value and value be lost. Because when that is lost, then life might not be so lovely and it might be harder to love. Ayn Rand is trying to defend life. It is a book that is about the love of life, how it may be maintained. And this is not an easy question. And of course, there are other questions to be made about it. And in the money speech, she said in that dollar there, that which should have been gold. She's very critical of non-sound money. She would not defend a world today that does not have sound money. You cannot assume she would be in favor of modern capitalism. And in fact, it's so critical to note she's particularly critical of the speculators and the financiers. She's not against all banking, because I think it's Mark, there's a character who's a banker in the Galt, but she's also aware of it's one of the more dangerous forms of monetary. And also the main emphasis in Atlas Shrugged is a capitalism of the engineer, of the inventor, of the creator, of the artist. It makes me think of Dietrich McCloskey, who says capitalism should have never been called capitalism. It should have been called something like creatism or creationism or innovationism, some sort of push on the creative element. Because when you call it capitalism, it creates the impression that the system is about capital accumulation and that's what makes it successful. No. No matter how many guns you have and you point at people, you can never turn that piece of paper into a dollar. So he says in the speech, you can have all the capital in the world and you cannot turn it into value unless you have good men of good virtues who agree to work together toward a common good that they on their own terms and their own values are willing to work toward. You can have all the guns you want and you cannot turn paper into money. And that's why calling capitalism is so problematic, because it makes the wrong notion of what the system is supposed to be. The system is supposed to be a way where people can come together and create together. We do not see Gulch as a Forbes 40, below 30 sort of groups of elites. That's something like the Sarah wedding party where you have all the moochers together. That's what we call Gulch now. Now, what we see in the Gulch is people who love life, who see this ability to love life. We have Ola excited with his little lunchbox going down the street to go. This great billionaire who's done all these things, who's just excited with his lunchbox going down the street because he's in a place where value equals value, where there is no mystery of what is good. It is a place of that sort of clarity. So you can walk down the road with your lunchbox and know that you're building something. Where in the world that's outside the Gulch, it's not clear if what you're building is contributing to the looting or if it's contributing to something good. But in the Gulch, it's clear. So then you have the guy running excited to be a janitor. Does this sound like the elites that we associate Gulch with? These people that are the CEOs of a company in the Gulch, we see people excited about raising chickens. Because what the Gulch is about is a place where life is alive and you can know the terms of life and you're not confused about it. And you know that the people around you are not judging you as doing something beneath you or whatever because you're raising chickens, because raising chickens can be just as good as being the CEO of a company if it is a testament to life and the engine of the world that makes life alive. And so we see bankers raising chickens or doing their own banking because that's what the Gulch is about, a place where life is alive. And that's what Ayn Rand is defending, and she understands capitalism can be part of that equation. And I hope on this very day we might defend something similar.
Well said. Also makes me think about how Dagny likes when she's in Galt's Gulch and she trades her suits for the peasant skirt.
There is yes, absolutely.
Because she finds the value. I mean, I think that also people like to misread, or they like to project some sort of like weird, like her romantic feelings for John Galt. They like to project like some sort of like weirdness onto it, but it's like, but that's the value of like being in love with a man of value. Like, as much as that is like, so those phrases are so overblown because they're so like they're part of a giant memeplex, but it's true. Like that's where it comes from. And Dagny's also like very surprised in Galt's Gulch about the deflationary prices of everything, where she like eats a great meal and she's like, this is only $2. Why are you charging $2 for this amazing meal kind of thing? And but because there is no inflation and it's just this like circular economy. What I really though appreciate about the original comment that you made about 1984 and a larger problem of science fiction being like, oh, we'll stop this because we'll be able to see it. what has always stuck with me from Atlas Shrugged is like one particular chapter that starts out with a copper wire broke, and the chapter starts out like that, and then you see the consequences of that copper wire breaking. Signals are down on the trains can't run, and everything sort of like falls apart. And so you get this very clear outline of the domino effect of a malfunctioning society, and it comes from malfunctioning machines. But then the parallel to that in that same chapter, she talks about all of the very insidious ideologies and moral platitudes that Jim Taggart and Wesley Mouch and Orrin Boyle, all of these people have these very moralistic, holier than thou attitudes, and because of those attitudes, they put into place certain policies that cause the degradation of the material world, that cause the degradation of that copper wire that allowed it to break. And so I think that what makes Atlas Shrugged so different from 1984 also is that she just lines it up so clearly of like, you're never going to recognize the totalitarianism, because the totalitarianism is like this, it's shrouded in these more overly moralistic platitudes.
That's put very well. The great thread is people just disappearing. Or one day at the end is like, can I have jam with my bread? Oh, we don't have any jam. What do you mean? The delivery didn't come in. Oh, the wire's not done. Just slowly and gradually, someone just happens not to be there, or someone else was doing. This is how it goes. It is this gradual sort of moving away where it was not me, or it's not there. Or at, the money speech scene where everyone's talking about how evil money is. And then Francisco's like, hey, Reardon, watch this. And he starts saying, oh, no, I need a loan. I need a loan. And everyone's like, is there something wrong with the copper company? He's like, yeah, real sorry. And then suddenly all these people who hate money run out to call their stockbrokers because they all have money in the very company that's so evil. And Francisco's like, yeah, I guess I was tired of being evil. And it turns out that the truth of the matter is that that very structure that they're calling evil has to be there so that they can call it evil. Right. And it's all well and good. And when it starts to break, people who the other day was telling you how evil money is, the next day are selling their stock secretly so that you don't know about it. It's all of these kind of invisible operations that occur. And it, like you say, if a world suddenly appears where you don't have access to clean water, it's not going to be anyone's fault. It's just going to not be there. And it's going to be that no one chose to do the job to provide the water. But the hard, concrete reality will be is that you cannot access the water. The problem is today, and it's one of the reasons, one of the reasons also to take Ayn Rand seriously is because so many people hate her. When you have that many people who passionately dislike a thinker, it tends to be an indication that the person is poking at something important, because that sort of vehement response means that it's probably poked something that people in the back of their mind know is a problem, right? So the very fact you have this sort of despise, and also with the sexuality stuff, what you see in that, the love of what Ayn Rand is pointing toward is characters that are looking for this overflow of love or something greater than themselves to overcome them that they can operate according to. Yes, people critique the rape scenes and all of those different things like that, or they call them rape scenes, but what you see, and there is a psychoanalytical take that you can have on these things, but what you see in all of these characters is looking for a place where something greater than themselves overcomes them. And the main thing they want it to be is life. When you're in the Galt, it's like life is dripping from everything. This place is alive. It overcomes you. But in order to do that, you have to have the kind of people who are able to have the objectivity and forwardness to keep value and value together. It doesn't just happen magically. It requires people to keep together value and value, social value and ethical value. And the main reason why she defends individualism or selflessness is because if you do not, ironically, this is what ends up happening. When you focus on the individual, you're actually more likely to keep ethical value and social value together. This is the great irony. When you separate individual value and social value, that's precisely when the break between the two values occur. I'll talk all the time against how, like, a lot of great literature is about irony, like Harold Bloom will talk about in different things. And irony is where you do X thinking you'll get Y, and X is precisely why you don't get Y. Irony is not merely misfortune, but a doing X for getting Y, and that's why you don't get Y. Likewise, what Ayn Rand understood is when you separate the social good for the individual good, you lose both. It's like the C.S. Lewis first things first principle as well. If you put first things first, you get second things as well. If you put second things first, you lose both, right? So there's this notion that when ethics is defined beyond the individual, as opposed to making the individual, which is the concrete reality, the first, not exclusion. People think he's saying exclusive. No, it's an ordering principle. Because St. Augustine will say that evil is a result of misordered good. Everything that exists is good, so evil must be a misordered good, right? A misordered relationship to the good. And what she understands is that if the ethical does not originate with the individual, then it's put out of order with the social, and you actually lose both. And actually the individual becomes more unethical. That's the other irony, is that the individual, because to be an individualist means you're what? Critically responsible for your individuality and does not deny reality. Like for her, another way to put this, if you say, oh, I'm an individualist, and you look at a copper wire that's broken and you do not fix it, nope, you're actually not being selfish, because you're not taking responsibility for what you've seen and what you can do, right? The moment you engage in plausible deniability, denial of the concrete, or do not address the problems that are in you in the concrete world, you're just an egotist. You're not an actual individual, because if you were truly an individual, you would say, well, it's now my responsibility to fix that copper wire. It's now my responsibility to provide water for people. It's my responsibility. That's the key, is what do you see? Are you doing something about it? Are you accepting that reality? And then are you making something happen? If we're not talking that, we're not talking Ayn Rand's individual. We're talking about some sort of vague egotist that then it's a straw man, frankly.
An effective altruist too.
Yes, that's exactly right. It all becomes straw men at this point. And again, I think it is deeply unfortunate that Ayn Rand is susceptible to these straw men. You can make all the valid arguments you want, that's fine, but straw men is a different matter, because what you do is she accurately does predict how societies break down. They do break down through a collapse of the supply chain. They do break down through, you could argue the number one cause of wealth inequality is unsound money. This is a very strong argument that you can make, right? She argues these things. It seems to be very true. And yet we throw this book aside and read 1984. That will give us no tools to identify how the world is falling apart, except very simple ones that then make us overconfident, and then the supply chain breaks down and we wondered what happened to the world. Well, as Francisco says, you might want to look at yourself.
Yeah, I think there are probably a few countries in the world today that are beginning to evidence this principle in action. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been listening to was listening to a little bit of Dr. Jordan Peterson the other day, and he, through his decades of looking at totalitarianism in Russia and elsewhere, came to very much the same conclusion, that once you break away from the individual as the first principle and you place the collective above it, or the social good, that's pretty much the road to hell. And the other important conclusion he draws, which lines up with Atlas Shrugged very well, is that the basis of the dictatorship, the basis of the totalitarian society is not the dictator, it's the lie. It's the lie, it's the small lie, it's the small disconnect from reality or rationality that underlies it, and it trickles all the way down, and in some ways perhaps trickles all the way up as well. And so it's interesting that in some ways this book doesn't really presence formal religion very much. She's considered more of a secular or an atheist thinker, but from my reading of it, she's really spiritualizing, as Daniel suggested, like she's spiritualizing our true coupling with reality at all cost. And there are these profound moments in the later stages of the book, in particular, thinking of Reardon's employee who kind of sacrifices himself to take a stand for Reardon and his values and his factory. And there's this feeling in that moment of like he feels more alive in that moment of standing for truth than he has in anything else. It's like he's woken from the dream, and like for that moment when he's taken a stand and is actually dying because of it, he's more alive and more in contact with reality he has been before that.
That's also, just
Similarly,
to briefly just disrupt you, that's also like I find that to be a very religious moment, because he makes a conversion and then he's a martyr. It's very religious.
I was also feeling in this morning as I was reading the final chapters that there are definitely some Christ-like symbolisms around John Galt in the book. In particular, this instance where he's kind of asking Dagny to betray him in service of him, and a very like betray him and accept reward, which is like such a clear like Judas type metaphor. And in the last moment, well, not in his last moments, but basically when he gets to the brink and he's been captured by the looters, he is able to hold this position where ultimately they have no hold on him, because he's resting in some truth that is superseded by any threat of violence. And this is like ultimately destructive to the regime that's rooted in violence. And there's this powerful invitation through several instances in the last stages of the book of not just non-compliance, but active small local stands for truthful coupling with reality. And she kind of shows us that this is destructive to the regime that is kind of that emerges out of the collective lie or the collective rejection of there being a real on which to stand.
And that's what's funny about that torture scene of John Galt, is like his commitment. I mean, in a very larger ideological sense, his commitment to truth is what allows him to be the victor and triumphant. But then in a very, as is the case throughout this entire novel, in a very practical sense, his commitment to truth is also what saves him, because the machine malfunctions. They're like, their torture device, their weapon completely malfunctions, because there's, the scientists have made a mistake, because science and the rational thought have not been followed through. And so, and that's the great joke as well, is like, they didn't flip the right switch or whatever. And then Jean Galt proceeds to tell them exactly what to do.
That's right.
It's one of my favorite parts. It's very deranged. It's very dark.
Oh yeah. Well, in that, it's a very important symbol where, if we take the Christ metaphor a little, more, there's this idea in which Jesus tricks the devil to put him in the place where the devil is defeated, because it unveils that the devil has no power. Precisely, you kill God and then God's resurrected. Well, then Satan loses. Like, what's supposed to be the master stroke ends up being the end of it. So likewise, what you see with Galt there is precisely the moment where destroying Galt requires Galt to tell you how to do it. Well, that means evil is an utter privation, to use that sort of language. That means this kind of darkness is a lack of any substance in of itself. And that's, Ayn Rand can be read as a giant book on spiritual warfare in a very real sense. And it is, really. She also understood critically that there's no such thing as pragmatism without metaphysics. You cannot avoid a metaphysics or a philosophy. There's a lot of people like, oh, we're just utilitarians, right? Well, who defines the terms of utility, right? According to what terms? And basically what goes on is like, basically, if the terms of utility and concrete and practice are not within the realm where there's a one-to-one or very strong connection between ethical value and monetary value, then there will be a slippage that gradually results in the utilitarian and pragmatic coming to be in service of something that is not actually ethical, or that thinks it's ethical and it's actually a snake eating its own tail. Like what you see in Ayn Rand is an understanding of how evil operates. It is a snake eating its own tail. It's ultimately a self-consuming entity, and that is how societies end. Societies end through self-consumption. You cannot imagine, the classic example is, of course, the Gauls sacking Rome. Well, that cannot occur until decades and decades of Rome eating itself. There has to be a lead up to that, right? And so likewise, the French Revolution requires decades and decades of lead up. The moment the snake doesn't eat itself until the very last moment, and then it's gone. And that's how it works. And she understood that requires Basically, what you see Galt doing is saying, let us remove all sources of plausible deniability that the snake is eating itself. As long as Dagny is there, as long as people are there, then the snake can deny it's eating itself. But if all Galt is doing is saying, let's force people to see what they're doing, that's his biggest weapon. Just tearing the veil. Let's just let them see what they're doing and allow no more plausible deniability. And also, plausible deniability is the greatest defense against responsibility. Because if you can say, oh, well, I was only doing that because I thought it was good or it was bad or because other people, then you can kind of get away with continually doing it. So the whole novel is about how the way the good or value prevails is by removing plausible deniability. And what does that do? It creates the one-to-one connection again between ethics and society in terms of value. And so the whole thing can be seen as a spiritual warfare. Now, also, he has many characters. He has that scene where the guy's laying on the bed. He's like a spiritual guru. So he has no tolerance for this. He is an atheist. So he is against all disembodiment. And, we've talked before in the Wrestling with Christianity. I would hope Christians are against all disembodiment. This notion of dualism and Cartesianism, and for her, forms of Kantianism that has infected religion, has indeed been very, very destructive. And what you see today is a return in Christianity to an incarnation, to an embodiment, to a Eucharist, to a thinking in these different terms. I think, but that's not what Ayn Rand knew. This is not what she's familiar with. She's also familiar, unfortunately, with an East Orthodox church that has been taken over, and at points where they have the Stalin as basically a face that, these very dark things. But also she comes to America. I think in one of the interviews, she talks about the scope trial. I mean, she's seeing the fundamentalism and this kind of anti-science attitude that's developing in religion. So one cannot blame her for these sort of sentiments that she's putting forth. And also, if she may have lived to have seen what the word selfish and capitalism came to mean, she might be, let me go back and make some more clarifications on these things. Because look, it's become this. The other thing that I will say, Ayn Rand, one of the reasons I think Ayn Rand gets misread is because she almost in a way gives too much credit to the reader. Like, oh, you missed the if. Oh, you missed the then. Oh, you missed that clause. The text is very dense, right? There are certain lines, like I already mentioned, I'll just make this example again. In the Francisco speech, the money speech, he says, which that money you have, which should have been gold, that should have been gold is extremely important. Because sound money is at the center of our thinking. If sound money is not a given, well, we're talking about something else. We're not talking about the means of ethical exchange between people, right? So there's all of these if-then clauses, because he's a philosopher, that you see when we read a book, say, that is clearly like not a literature, it's not a novel, you're reading philosophy, you'd see that. It's like, oh, well, but Kant said here, you got to read the first critique with the second critique and the third, and there's all this if-thenning and kind of the benefit of the doubt, or at least this kind of understanding that everything is contingent upon everything else. People don't do that with Ayn Rand. And you see, as a result, the disagreements with Ayn Rand are not productive, nor, frankly, are many people who call them Randians productive, because they defined, being a Randian as being someone who makes a lot of money. No, it's about loving life a lot. You can make all the money you want, and it's not going to matter. You make the great example with Dagny. It's like she wants this handmade clothing, right? She wants this you have people in Galt's. If they had to choose between $1 billion that was made unethically and a piece of clothing that was made ethically by someone, that's an easy choice. That clothing is actually worth way more than that pile of $1 billion over there, because this is a testament to life. This is not a testament to life. The arguments he makes is that money, in terms of a society, is the only way to have a testament to life and have the exchange between people who are different and interacting one another. So he's also dealing with the problem that no philosopher wants to touch, which is the problem of scale. How do you scale and make a society of people who are different, interacting with one another without a totalitarian structure? And she's like, the only way I see it is with money, with economics. And she understands that, Kant's like, we're going to make the kingdom of ends by making the rational the good. She's like, that doesn't work, because people have different ideas of what constitutes the good if it's not clearly connected with the virtue. You have Marx, well, we're going to have a revolution. She's like, well, that's not going to work, because that assumes that the people who revolt aren't going to seize power and become the same people, and then you destroy everything. It doesn't work. So the question she is dealing with and coming with the Soviet Union is arguably the hardest philosophical problem at all that no one today wants to touch. There's a lot of people talking about game A and game B, and they've got all these ideas of the new society or whatever. But when it comes to, well, how are you going to scale that game B society? How are you going to make other people? No idea. No idea. Of course you don't, because it's the hardest problem on planet Earth. And I'm not trying to be mean, but you see it's very easy. You can look at Ayn Rand as an entrepreneur in the problem of scale. Like she's looking at the problem of scale that many philosophers don't want to think or look at. And when you look at that and try to think how you can have a society at scale that entails difference and diversity and different views without being totalitarian, for her, it seems like it's undoable without something like money. So let's see if money is ethical. And she's like, yes, there's a way to do money that's ethical. Then it is possible to have an ethical society at scale. This is the key. It is possible. Now, will it? Could it? These are other matters. A strong critique against Ayn Rand would be to say something like, there's no such thing as a John Galt. There are no people like this. These are imaginary characters, right? That's what some people would say. And if you say that, and there's probably some degree of truth to that, although then it's dangerous to act like everyone's mediocre. There's a ditch on either side of the road, right?
Right, exactly.
Now, the issue you could say is, well, how do you identify a John Galt, right? How do you hermeneutically interpret one? Well, we can have that discussion. And also you would say, what would a Galt look like in the world today, right? Well, the funny thing is Ayn Rand say, well, it could be the woman down the street who's growing her own like crops because he actually loves life. That's what we don't understand. We assume the Galt figure has to be the CEO of a company. That is not what he's saying at all. The Galt figure can be the family down the street that has their own chickens, dang it, who actually believes in a virtuous life that they're making their own way. This is the huge mistake with her thinking. Because a lot of her characters are successful, which of course she would want. If she thinks capitalism is kind of the testament to the ethical, then the ethical people would be successful at that system. So people then go, oh, okay, well, then it's successful people in capitalism that are Galt. Never mind, most of the bad guys with all the power are bankers and CEOs and company heads as well, right? The key is that the John Galt is not the person who can necessarily create the engine with infinite energy and all that. Of course, that should be lionized and should be prided, but it's not that's not what Galt has to look like. Galt is the person who loves life and will fight for it. That's Galt. And that's what we need to look for. But the problem is people are looking for a Galt who makes an infinite energy and does all these values like, there's no such thing as John Galt. Yes, if you define John Galt as that, it might just be some sort of tech CEO who's actually a dick. Yeah, but that's not Galt. Galt can be the guy down the street who like lives life to the fullest and fights for it and does not expect other people to owe them anything, nor do they think guilt or pain or whatever entitles them to anything. That could be the guy down the street who's only making $30,000 a year. That's why it's so important that John Galt is working on a rail line as a lowly worker and all these people with these lowly works, where he has that wonderful line where he's like, yeah, but they can pay for my body, but they can't pay for my mind, right? These wonderful parts in it. But what the key is to understand the Galt person can be the person down the street making 30K a year who is just fighting for life. That's what we have to understand. Understand that, then you can see what he's talking about everywhere if you look for it and you have the eyes to see.
This is why I really get peeved when people are like, oh, Elon Musk is the John Galt of our world. Elon Musk is maybe a Hank Rearden, maybe.
Sure, and I'm not bashing him, but it's too simplistic. But it's just like the simplest thing in the world.
And a good friend of mine who is a very incredibly well versed in Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged as well, but he's always saying that the true John Galts of the world are also the ones who are very invisible and who stay very invisible, which is true, and that's exactly what John Galt does as well. The other thing too. If I don't lose my train of thought. Oh, yes, the idea of scaling and the idea of how do you find this like more metaphysical or sort of ideological value? How can you exchange for that? And again, this money speech, the Francisco money speech, is so to me, the Francisco money speech is more important than John Galt's speech.
It is. Yeah, I agree.
John Galt's speech is very virtuosic and wonderful, but the money speech is so key because that seems like a point where it seems like one of Ayn Rand's treaties where she's like fixing dualism in a way, where she says that like money is this technology, is this great technology where you can trade this value that you've cultivated in yourself, whether that's a value of your own intellect and your own intellect and reason and what allows you to create beautiful free energy motors, or this like amazing alloy steel. If you can figure out how to trade the value of your mind and transmute that into value of the material world, the way that you do that, or the way that you create that value, or the way that you have like a measurable standard of value for your mind transmuting into the material world, that is money. Money is the technology that does that. Money is the tool that does that. And yeah, when money is not backed by something like gold, or I'm always saying that Ayn Rand would have been a Bitcoiner. When that money is not backed by proof of work, the proof of work math equation that the computers do to mine the Bitcoin, then you don't have any standard, and nothing means anything. You have no standard of measure. And so therefore, like, you can convince yourself, you can denigrate the value of your mind and say that it's less valuable or more valuable than whatever is happening materially in the world. And so money is this bridge between the metaphysical and the pragmatic, which is very, very key. And that's why I think that that's a way more important speech.
Yeah, I'd love to double click on a couple of things here, because this feels like another area where it really like draws down practically and pragmatically. And I can actually feel the way that reading the book has been affecting me as I'm like undergoing the process of like rethinking my relationship to business and entrepreneurship, and especially for like this part of the internet, this part of Twitter, people involved in liminal web and sometimes ethereal kinds of transformative practices and spaces where it's not as concrete as a piece of steel when you offer something like philosophy or what have you. And there's a great deal of like implicit notions in relationship to money that we inherit, especially in spiritual contexts, which kind of debase money or make a challenging relationship to it. And I've just found that engaging with this text has exalted the value of exchange. It's exalted the value of receiving value and money being the medium through which that occurs. And of course, we all kind of know that. That's not like a super rarefied idea, but the way that it's really richly laid out in this book has given me more of a grasp on that, in a sense of actually there can be a good in this. There can be a good to realize value and to actualize that through the exchange of money. So I wanted to like get your guys' thoughts on just some of the implications of that for this part of the internet. And just a quick, totally way before this, to double click on the anti-clericalism, the anti-religiosity. I think it very like Christopher Hitchens style, like anti-clerical spirit, anti-mystic in particular, which was quite strange at first. It seems to me the root of that is about giving over the power of your mind, giving over your own power to religious authority. So it's very consistent with the root theme of the book, which is that your mind, your independent thinking, your figuring it for yourself, even if it's not perfect, is always more important than offloading that to some arbitrary scientific, public health, what have you, authority.
What's funny about that is that she's very clearly anti-institution, anti-clerical, but then she and anti-mystic as a byproduct of that. But there's the part in the book where Dagny she has to disrupt her dinner party, or some like dinner that she's at, because the trains aren't running, and so she has to go down into the tunnels. And this is when she tells the men that they're going to manually switch the lights. They're going to hold the lanterns. They're going to be the signals, as though they've regressed back into the 1860s or whatever. And she sees John Galt, and he's one of her employees at Tiger Transcontinental. And then she goes and she's like running into the tunnel to go to where she has stashed his motor. And she's like, her internal monologue in her mind, she's like, you will be in that tunnel. And like she sort of metaphysically summons John Galt. And when I read that particular plot point, I'm just like, Ayn Rand doesn't know that that's exactly what manifestation is. This like idea that your prayer, that your psycho-spiritual prayer manifests practically in the world. It's really funny. And so I also think that like, I think that there's a little bit of grace that we can give Ayn Rand too, where she is so anti-institution that but the thing is that she's anti-institution, and she also is anti-dualism. She understands that we exist both in the spiritual and the physical world, and so she makes such an expert connection between the two that she's just like, she rejects the spiritual world because it's all one for her, because she just rejects dualism. But to some degree, a lot of deep spiritualists also reject dualism, because they see them as one. I mean, it's a tricky paradox, I think. But yeah, I think that the key interpretation is anti-institution.
And any thoughts on this matter of like selfishness? I think is really powerful. Like the redefining of selfishness in the book as like, actually it's, self and then world that follows. And if you compromise yourself, everything else becomes compromised as well.
Well, a way to think of it is, if you don't have any standards, then you can't make any decisions. Like if you say, oh, I'm going to go to Food Lion today instead of Kroger's, I would ask you why. You say, oh, because they have better prices, right? There's a standard of decision making. The argument that she's making is that if the self is not first, you have no standard of decision making. You have no standard of operation other than what someone else tells you. And you see, in that way, she would look at you and say, it's not. She would look at you and say, she's like, it's not because I just like wanted one day for selfishness to be more important than like selflessness. She would say the world is a place where the only way all decisions start with a self that makes standards on what is good for it and what is not. And then that is all coordinated in an emergent result. She doesn't have any language back then, like of emergence or collective intelligence, all these things that are very hot today. But that would be what she's getting at. And she's like, what's very interesting, I don't think she would at all be against emergence. Like she would basically say, because you can look at John Galt as what? One big emergence. All these people come together and they emerge to society. This is what she would say. She's defending the individual for the possibility. She's defending the individual for the possibility of emergent society, which is different from collectivist society. And if you don't put the individual first, you can't get an emergent society, only a collectivist society. And a collectivist society is totalitarian. There is a massive difference for her. I think she just doesn't have this language. You're always stuck in your moment, right? So likewise, she's speaking to the religion she knows. She's not speaking to shamanism or ancient religion. She's speaking to what's alive in the West, and she's aware that this is dangerous. So she's like, should the book be 20,000 pages going through the difference of every single possible manifestation of religion, different things? I tell this to Michelle sometimes. It's like, if your book is too short, people are upset because it doesn't go into detail and leaves out a lot. But if it's too long, they don't read it. So you're screwed, basically. Like if if you don't make a map that isn't the territory, you screwed up and you're wrong, right? It's very funny. We say we know the map is not the territory, but then when the map is not the territory, we're angry. But I think that's actually a psycho trick to get rid of it. We say, oh, the map's not the territory, therefore I don't have to deal with the map. I don't have to address it, right? It's a trick that you do. You say, oh, it doesn't address every form of religion, therefore it's wrong. I don't have to take it seriously. That's very simplistic. I think there are some things to say on the way, but the key is we should not assume that being against collectivism is against being emergentism. In fact, the argument is that if you focus and defend the individual, emergence becomes possible. Because think about it. What is money? Money is the possibility of people working together. The whole thing is about how do you get people to work together in an ethical way? It cannot be saying that working together is bad or that other people don't matter. The whole thing is a giant defense of the possibility of interacting with other people in a frickin' ethical way. The whole
That's
idea.
Galt's Gulch.
Yes.
The communitarianness of Galt's Gulch. Yes.
It's very, I know Jonathan, there are other people that talk about communitarianism. She may not have, that's a different ball. All these things get conflated. And the other thing is problematic, like, so for example, to give Karl Marx some credit, I don't think Karl Marx would look at, say, some of the forms of totalitarianism that occurred in the name of Marxism and say, I support that. What he'd probably say is, I didn't know it would lead to that, right? So the funny thing is very often with philosophers, they'll be quick to say, see, it's just very interesting that Ayn Rand gets every like negative response or interpretation, whereas other philosophers, you always give the benefit of the doubt. It's just very interesting. There are one wonders of these things. And actually for me, that's always been a reason I'm interested in it, because I'm like, well, it's kind of interesting. We give a lot of the benefits of the doubt to these other philosophers over here, but Ayn Rand, like, it's either like a problematic, there is a form of Randianism that's almost kind of like naively religious. Like it's just not, it's kind of an unthinking, yeah, egotism, but that's like the Elon Musk stuff you talked about. But then it's either that, or this very like, she's stupid and we shouldn't even talk about her books. And that's always kind of interested me with her, which then almost, I guess, in reading Ayn Rand, the very fact that that has always been the response actually speaks to the very negative spiritual energy the whole book is about, right? That people can't look at what's in front of them. Like they have to either swerve off in a thoughtless direction, one side or the other. And that's, I think one of the reasons people don't like Ayn Rand is because her philosophy tries to be so concrete. Where other philosophers, it's a little more open, it's a little more vague. Like we don't get like a particular defense in a lot of the other philosophers of what a business looks like or what the economy looks like. You get more kind of big ideas of alienation or the good being the good being the rational or no the thing. But it's almost like, it's just like the book, like the characters who say something straight on are hated or no one likes that and it's cold. So likewise, Ayn Rand and being kind of very straight up, like this is how it happens, and this is how, so it's like, oh, we hate that stuff. Let's go to the philosophers that are a little vaguer. It kind of actually speaks to the very ethos of the book in different ways.
And that's precisely what we're witnessing right now, especially like during the COVID era and the pervasive attempts to shut down direct speech is basically all the transgressives who have fuck you money or at least a sufficient degree of autonomy are people who speak directly, not always well, because it's mediated through these platforms like Twitter and they have their own limitations. But you think about Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, all of these are people who are very, very committed to saying precisely what they're thinking about a topic. And so they all end up the enemy of the regime that does not want people to speak directly in that way.
And it's a horror. That's the other thing, is it's a horror. There's a very clear, people are horrified by John Galt's speech because he's revealing what is true and what has been shrouded, what has been covered up. And it's the same with Joe Rogan. I think about Joe Rogan with the mRNA guy, which was I think the thing that like kickstarted the whole like the protest against Spotify or whatever. Like all of these things that are just not stated explicitly. Like everybody, like sometimes it feels like this current society, the only thing that's holding it together is the fact that people just don't acknowledge reality. And people are just like leaving things covered up, and people just, they don't say what, if you leave it unspoken, then it can't cause any damage. And I mean, that's a huge ethos of the John Galt speech as well, is like that I'm keeping the truth back, and so therefore the truth, the inevitability of my fate will not touch me. That's like the famous contradiction of this world. And yeah, I think that was a huge. I think that people at least in America or in the Western world, have felt this, but COVID was the thing that drew back the curtain, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
the suppression of speech.
At least for some. And there's also this sense of like, for those who go and live in the valley, basically all the industrious and creative people who are connected with truth end up withdrawing into their own community. And the condition of participating in that community or in that kingdom is that you don't turn away from all of the shit that's going on. They have to look precisely into the darkness and all of its detail. They have to see the horror of things falling apart. They have to look at this kind of, there's this weird totalitarian guise that the looters or the regime always practices. If they want to seem nice, they want to seem friendly, the gun, the knife is always veiled behind. It's like, no, we don't want to be forceful. No, we don't want to be aggressive. But that's always there. And so you have to look cleanly straight into it. And I think there is something spiritual in that as well, that they're demanded to like look down into the abyss and yet not be devastated by that. And so there's a profound resource and there's a profound lifefulness that's demanded of them, whether it's pursuit of industry, pursuit of creation, pursuit of truth, or pursuit of love. And I really love the notion that kind of romance between these characters constitutes a form of resistance to
I know,
the
I love it too.
totalitarian world. Yeah,
I love that too. It's so incredible. And people also misread Ayn Rand because they're like, oh, well, she's just like cheap erotica at the end of the day. Like her novels are bad because there's like plot holes or whatever. You know, people find every excuse to critique Ayn Rand. But then they also, the funniest thing to me is like, this is just like erotica. Like what's the use of this? But it's so good. And it's so like, it's like the utopia, like Ayn Rand's version of free love is like the utopic. It's so utopic. Everything like what actually manifested out of free love was, you know, not kind of missed the mark. But anyway, I don't have anything intellectual to say about that. I just think that that's really good. The other thing though too, is we see this in Dagny's whole conflict and also her conversion. And Daniel said this at the beginning, that her contradiction for her is it like she's living in this contradiction. It's hard for her to see. She thinks of John Galt as the destroyer, and she is just like living in this very backwards notion for most of the novel, where she thinks that she needs to be saving her rail line, she needs to be saving that world, but really it's a fiat world and it's not backed by anything. And finally, her conversion moment is when she has to look at the darkness and to say like, okay, I have to turn my back on everything that my family has built. I have to turn my back on this dynasty that I am a part of, and I have to just go to Galt's Gulch and rebuild it, or build something completely new. And I think that there's Dagny responds to the horror in the virtuous way, I guess.
No, everything that's been said is so critically important. A way to think about it is she is against all ideas of adding to life as opposed to seeing or realizing life. So, for example, a religion that says we need to add heaven to the world, or God needs to come to the world, or we need to add a new social structure, like there's something in addition to life that needs to be added, or life is broken. So you would say no. If you were to say, well, what if God was life and there was a Trinity community, like all these different kind of theology we can get into, or what if mysticism is a form of realizing what's there, not adding an alternative dimension, her response could easily be very different. But all she knows are forms of mysticism and religion that are adding. Likewise, we need to add a different social structure and so on and so forth. So one trick, like, so for example, you mentioned money. Well, actually, I think I have a dollar bill somewhere. That would be appropriate, dollar bill, right? So the point is, like, C would be like, you don't need to add anything to life to make this piece of paper $1. You already have within you the ability to make this piece of paper $1 if you realize that ability and you fight for that ability and then base a society on it. You know, there's nothing that needs to be added to the human consciousness or whatever to turn a concrete reality in something with metaphysical significance. It's there. The potential for it is there to the degree the human mind realizes it. And that is kind of the idea, because once you start saying, oh, this piece of paper can only be $1 if I have, you know, a government that says so, or a church that says so, well, then you're saying that another way to put it, she doesn't want a centralization of metaphysics. She wants a decentralization of metaphysics on every individual mind. And she understands that if you centralize metaphysics, you're screwed, because that means you centralize value and virtue, and then you're done, because that means you have a centralized center that decides what is virtuous, what is valuable, and everyone will have to do that, or they're what? Not valuable. And no one wants to do that. So then so she's in favor of a decentralization of metaphysics. And the thesis is, if you have money, have a one-to-one relation between value ethically, value of economy, then you can have that decentralization of metaphysics while also having intelligibility between different people. That's the key. How do you have decentralization but still have shared intelligibility? That's a massive problem, right? We can have shared intelligibility if we all have the same metaphysics, right? But how do you have decentralized metaphysics, but enough shared intelligibility to where we can community, ergo the problem of scale? This is an unbelievably difficult problem, and she's arguing that money seems to be the only way that you can do it, and the capacity to make money. Because money is a concrete reality that does have a shared degree of metaphysics, but the way that metaphysics is used is individualized. Every individual can use that money for their own. So what do we see? We see decentralization, but shared intelligibility, arguably the hardest philosophical accomplishment of all. And she's arguing that economics is that. That's what economics at its finest is. And I completely agree that one of the great mistakes is not understanding that economics is birthed out of the question of human motivation. When you look at Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiment, it starts very, very philosophical in the Scottish Enlightenment when we're looking at capitalism. It's not about liquidity or margin or all these models or different things. It's like, hey, how are humans motivated and to not be at the muzzle of a gun? Well, that's really difficult. Well, economics was birthed from a philosophical problem of human motivation. And by losing track of this, we have no idea what it does. But she's trying to remind you. And the other thing that we always is very, very important, like when she talks about the muzzle of a gun, you know, and I agree that the money speech is really important. The other thing I'll say is if you go, oh, it's just erotica. What are you talking about? It's like 900 pages. Like that's maybe 20 pages. Like also to, okay, let's say that the erotica scenes are bad and you don't agree with any of it. Fine. Well, just disprove the money speech, right? If I say 90 things, if I say 90 times 2 + 2 = 1, 2 + 2 = 3, 2 + 2 = 5, and I go all the way to the number 100, and then at 100 I say 2 + 2 = 4, that doesn't make what I just said any less false because I said it after saying 99 false things. There are many logical fallacies used on Ayn Rand that don't make any sense, because even if you agree, you think that there's a lot, like you could argue that in her personal life, she had that affair with a student that caused all sort of drama. You can say that was wrong. That was fine. I think that is a perfectly legitimate argument to ask, what is it in her philosophy that made her susceptible to that? That can be asked, and how could you avoid that? That's a very fair critique. But then that would not mean the money speech is false. That would require a different argument, right? But we make these fallacies with Rand that we would not make with Karl Marx or Lord Keynes or even Hayek. Even conservatives make these fallacies who kind of can agree with Ayn Rand because they don't. It's just very interesting. It shows that we have some sort of subconscious bias against the concrete philosophy. There's something going on there that makes us okay with logical fallacies we wouldn't do elsewhere, which would speak to her book, right? But the point I was going to say is when she talks about the muzzle of a gun, what's very important is another thing she could say is law. The arguments he wants to make is that the only way to have people interact if you don't have something like money is law. You have to try to make them come together because it's illegal for them not to come together, or this is the legal thing to do. The key thing that if you really, and I think Rothbard was big on this, he warned that we must never say the state equals the society. Once you do that, it's over because you're saying a society is the state. No. The state and society are different things. You can, he's an anarchist, of course, and he doesn't like the state at all. But what's very important is what she's arguing is that the only way to have shared intelligibility in terms of a society at scale that doesn't ultimately become reliant on the state is through money, because otherwise it will require law. That's a big mistake we're doing today. You see, if you don't have the ability to create values, then the only way to interact is what? Legally. The problem with legals is that's truly alienating. That's truly dehumanizing. And then the last point with it, what people don't, to me, the big thing with Ayn Rand is ultimately her whole philosophy is a question of friendship. How do you have friends? How do you have friends? Well, that requires shared value, right? Value is the only way to have friendship. You could theoretically have marriage just with law. You could have a job just with law. There are many things that you can do that you may not enjoy, of course, but you could theoretically arrange them with law. But friendship in particular seems impossible without a meaningful distinction between state and society. And I don't think it's by chance that right now people talk about the French Secession. Robert Putnam talks about the loss of social capital. You see the collapse of communities. I don't think it is by chance that has occurred when there has been a failure to understand that without the possibility of shared value, you cannot have friendship. Because why would you? That doesn't mean you dislike people. You can have all the associates in the world, all the people you have small talk at the grocery, that's fine. But a friend in the Cicero way, in that deep sort of resonance that suggests something more than yourselves in the concrete interaction with that person, that would require shared values. But that means you have to believe in them.
What's interesting about that, though, too, is like, I wonder if about John Galt's password, where he says, I will never ask another man to live for me. I will never expect to live for other people. And that seems a very basis of friendship as well. And I think that in an overly statist world where it's just assumed that everybody is subsidizing everyone else, that's a contradiction. No friendship can be forged because you're just resenting the other person, because you're working, like, everything that you're working for, it's automatically going to someone else who maybe doesn't have your same shared values, and like and there's this built up resentment that is very subconscious. I think that people don't really like stop to think about that too much. And yeah, friendship is impossible when you are made to live for other people. It does not create camaraderie, it creates resentment.
I think it's very easy to prove. If I look at you and say, Bethany, I will expect you to talk with me between 2 and 3. I will expect you to give me X, Y, and Z, and I will expect you to be nice to me. You might just happen to stop showing up. You might just happen to call a little less. You might slowly back away. That's the key. He's like, look at the whole novel is a drifting, a kind of drifting away of everything, where they just kind of go back. And the truth of the matter is, whenever anyone says something like, I expect, I think you should, or an obligation, then the person may go, okay, of course, but then they'll just stop showing up silently. They'll just vanish. But if I look at you instead, Bethany, and say, hey, Bethany, I never expect anything of you. You can come when you want, when you're available. We can talk about the books you want to talk about. I don't have any expectations. You don't owe me anything. You're like, well, great, maybe we'll hang out some, right? It's so obvious when you think of it in those terms, what it's saying. What destroys relationships? They talk about it all the time. Expectation. I expected you to do X, Y, and Z, and you didn't do it. Now I'm mad at you, right? What Ayn Rand understands is the irony is that collectivism creates what? Almost by definition, it has to be a society of expectation, right? And it's very well documented, I thought, that expectations in relationships destroy them, right? And there's a difference between, now there's obvious expectations, like if I'm in a relationship, I would expect you not to punch me, but is that really an expectation, or like expecting a fish to be in water if it's to breathe? Like at that point, it's so obvious. We're not even talking about expectation. We're talking about givens.
Well, and again, it's shared value.
Yes, it's just given. If I'm hanging out with you, you're not going to kill me. Okay, is that an expectation or the very condition that makes relation possible? Mm-hmm. Conflating given and expectation has been a major problem because it's made people dumb on this matter. An expectation is an obligation. And what Ayn Rand is saying is, do you really see friends or people having a good time or life being lived where there's a lot of expectation? Doesn't happen in marriage. Why would it happen in society? Why would it happen anywhere? And that's what that statement is getting at, is that. And it's obvious when you think of it in those terms.
The thing too is that is so well demonstrated in Hank's relationship to his family, where his family becomes completely obligatory. Lillian, his brother, his mother, and his mother is constantly harping on him because he's obligated to give his money to his brother, even though his brother's living with him, even though he's like subsidizing their entire lifestyle. But it all becomes an obligation, and that denigrates their familial bond. And it's because he feels like it just breeds resentment. The other thing too is just like, to go along with your example of like of proving how expectation ruins relationships. Like ostensibly the three of us are all friends because we have pursued our own self-interest by reading books. and then through that we have found these threads of commonality, and so we can be friends. We want to talk about this together because we've all arrived at these junctures of philosophy. I just want to make a point about collectivism and individualism, and it's slightly deranged. So just go on this journey with me, because I'll argue that collectivism, not antagonistic to individualism, which is the point that we've been making. And there is a philosophy of thought that has already worked this out, that has already thought about the fact that, okay, so you have collectivism and individualism. They exist on this axis, this push-pull tension, and they seem like opposites, but they're two sides of the same coin. They are opposites, but they exist with and for each other, and always coexisting to each other as two sides of the same coin. Collectivism is decentralized. Individualism is sort of centralized. You are expected as an individual to maintain your inner centralization, and you are expected to maintain, again, your own self-interests, and you are administering your own life for your own purposes, and you have your own motivation. Collectivism then is when everybody's doing that, when everybody is acting as an individual, then it makes the collective stronger. It creates a society that functions. It's again, this first principles building up at scale. You do not get collectivism unless you have individualism first, unless you have people who are pursuing their own interests. And so they're not antagonistic to each other. They are not opposite, and it does not, and one is not more moral than the other. Pursuing collectivism is not the morally superior choice over individualism. And so, and the philosophical thought that states this is astrology through the Leo and Aquarius axis, because Leo is 180 degrees away from Aquarius, and they're both, Leo is the ego, the individual, and Aquarius is the collective and the group and the humanitarian. People misread that all the time. You can imagine in New Age astrology, people completely misinterpret what Aquarius means. They think that Aquarius means social justice, but it absolutely doesn't. Leo and Aquarius are this axis of collectivism versus individualism, and how you both need one with the other. And there's all sorts of esoteric symbolism that's it's illustrated through the star card. The star tarot card is associated with Aquarius, and it has this it has the star in it, and you're supposed to understand that you can be your own center of your universe, of your solar system, but you're also just another star in the rest of the galaxy, kind of thing. And so I finish this off by saying Ayn Rand is an Aquarius. So do with that what you will.
No, I think what's so critical is there is a very real sense in which she's arguing there is, quote unquote, no such thing as collectivism, because as a value system, it eats itself. You can't do it. The question is, again, it's all order. It's like in the very same way, you could almost talk about decentralization with the DE in parentheses. When you make the individual first and you have the shared value, then what you get is this bothness. And that's really the other thing you see in life. It's never just, you don't get to choose either decentralization or centralization. Like for Augustine, it's order. What is the order between those things? And the idea is, well, let's make the centralized thing the individual, because it's the smallest possible unit of centralization. By definition, that's the smallest possible unit of totalitarianism. And there's going to be totalitarianism somewhere, some beginning of power. Let's concentrate it on the individual level. And then suddenly that turns to be in service of community, because everyone is using their total power on their total self to try to work with other people. And it's and guess what? If you don't force totalitarian or totalizing, you could say, on the individual level, then it has to go somewhere. By definition, the only other place you can go is oppressive. Anywhere higher up the stack than that, by definition, is oppressive. So the thesis that you see, and I think it's true, the thesis is you can never get rid of totalizing somewhere. The question is, where will it be? And it needs to be on the lowest individual level. And then it doesn't hurt anyone but yourself, basically, or you live and die by your own choices. And then from every one of those totalized individual units, they, according to their values, can interact with one another. So it's not an either or. Well, the other good point is Galt's is kind of something that Galt makes that offers to other people. Isn't that kind of, wait a minute, that's kind of selfless, right? He's making something and inviting other people to it, right? Galt's right in its very character shows that this cannot be a sort of we never do anything for other people, because you could argue all of Galt's is a kind of gift to all the people that are brought there, right? It's not so simple. The thing that so on what you're saying, another way to look at this is if we talk about, we made the distinction between state and society, right? Ayn Rand is defending social capital. So another big mistake that has happened is we don't understand classical conservatism, which was very interested in social capital, not just market forces. Now, today, capitalists are defending the free market, but Ayn Rand would easily say, but the market now doesn't have this strong connection between monetary value and ethical value. So defending the free market now may not be the correct thing. Now, there are defenses of the pricing mechanism from Hayek or von Mises and different things. But the key is what we have to see in Ayn Rand. She's asking the following question. How is it possible to have social capital at scale? You can, of course, have social capital in your family when you all kind of know one another and you're relatively similar. And you could all be Kantians or Marxists or whatever. It doesn't matter because it's small enough of a scale to where you can agree to the terms. And even if they're wrong, just by having a small scale, you can get through life, and there will arguably be negative consequences, but nothing apocalyptic, right? But as you move up the scale and include more and more and more people, the likelihood of there being social capital, which would by definition require what? Shared value, goes down, right? That requires money. So what we see, remember, he's basically obsessed with Aristotle in some ways. And Aristotle defines a political community as basically a polis, which is a community of friends. Friendship is the basis of communal life. Well, if friendship requires shared value, how do you have a nation of millions of people that have something closer in relation to friendship than legal obligation, muzzle of a gun, all of these things that remove value? Well, that would require some sort of shared language that we can all agree upon means there was some shared value and value created here. And Ayn Rand sees that possibility in money if money is sound. So he sees no other way to deal with the problem of scale and to make friendship at scale. And what she also shows you in this book, to finish the point, is the world ends by silent epidemics. Silent, quiet things. It's not so much an army show that by the time the Nazis take over, there's been 30 years of a silent epidemic eating away at the social capital. What is everyone talking about today? The mental health crisis silently in the background, the collapsing birth rate silently in the background, the unemployment silently in the background. As the stock market is going through the roof, you have people not paying for their mortgages. You have all the stuff going on in China with the real estate market. What is happening in the world today? There are silent epidemics everywhere that people don't know about. Some of the problems with the epidemics that people do know about is it makes them feel like those are the only ones, but there are all these things that are gradually, quietly falling apart in the background. People aren't, they talk about infrastructure. That's interesting. Infrastructure was big in Atlas Shrugged. You have these things going down. You have inefficiencies slowly cropping up here and there. The threat to the world are silent epidemics more so than loud epidemics. If they're loud, you hear them and you tend to respond to them. The silent ones are the ones that creep up on you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This just coming to me right now is that the whole discourse of the meta crisis is super like this is a text for that discourse. Yes. 100%. And it's really charting a course through that. And I just wanted to appreciate some of the last reflections you've had, because this is so radical. And if I had just abided by whatever general progressive aligned instincts I had when I was 17 or 18, I wouldn't have checked out this book and I wouldn't have received all that was in it. And this conversation has been a beautiful exemplification of friendship and philosophy when applied to a fictional text, and just how fractal this book is in terms of all the different things that we can draw out of it is amazing. But this notion of ego in service is such a radical drawing together of kind of paradoxical notions, which at least for me, it's taken a real long time to kind of put those together. But this book really makes the case. And I think your remarks, Daniel, have really demonstrated that to me. And also in regards to the romance and the relationships, we see that there is this greater creative will that they're in service to is what affords them to show up in those relationships well. And we see the people who are not animated by that having much more difficult relationships. There's clinging, there's more conflict between Hank and Dagny and Galt, especially when you have this kind of love triangle dynamic and how that's handled. That the party who's kind of losing in that is able to come out well or bigger is a demonstration of that he's actually just so devoted to that creative will, and all of them are, and that kind of governs their relationships in some ways, that higher calling. So yeah, I just wanted to round that out. And there's so much in this fucking book. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Bethany, for drawing it to my attention and organizing this reading group spontaneously, without the muzzle of a gun. Maybe we could have given you some money for it. That would have been nice too. But in any case, through your own creative will, you've made this happen, and the book will certainly have impact on me. And I hope that anybody who's called will check it out. But it definitely needs to be a voluntary journey and a curiosity to jump into this one. Yeah, we could certainly talk about this much more, but I want to invite any kind of closing, rounding out remarks from both of you.
I just think that Atlas Shrugged is like the manual for, like, an instruction manual for the world that we're living in today. I think that she applied her principles and saw what was going to happen. Her lived experience is certainly informing this, but this book is an application of first principles thought, and that's why she was able to tell the future. That's why she's able to offer up a solution as well too. And I was reading like little fragments of the John Galt speech, and he says, the world that you desire is yours. It exists, and it's there, and it's yours. And so it's really just like, people. I think that people just have to read this book. It's true that it has to be a voluntary journey, but also people just have to find each other. People have to cultivate their own self-interests, and the more that you do that, you will find other people, and then it'll all fall into place.
That was wonderful, Bethany, and thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I think this is a very important book, and I think everyone should read it. And I think it's hard to read it, though, because you hear so many things about it before you go into it, in the same way that it's hard to read most of the great books, precisely because you think you already know what it says. I think one of the ways I would implore people to look at the text, sure, we can make an argument that we would say, oh, if we return to the gold standard now, that'd be inefficient because it's too difficult to move around gold. It would slow down global liquidity and lead to financial crisis. You could say, well, it's too late to get rid of the Federal Reserve, blah, blah, blah. Now, of course, Bethany will tell us about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and I'm extremely interested. Yeah, there we go. And so there are arguments you can make where you say, well, she's naive on the gold standard. Okay, fine, whatever. You could say, well, there's a lot of people who take this book and they become like these egotistics that don't care about other people, and it's dangerous that way. Okay, well, yes, people can read the Bible and become dicks as well. I mean, so there's lots of room to go around for those different things. But go into the book asking the following question. When you read about people and interacting, can you arrive at friendship through Kantian ethics? Sure. Maybe you can arrive at duty and relationships to the state, and maybe you could have a functioning kingdom of ends. But let me ask you, do you think Kantian ethics could get you friendship? Could law get you friendship? Is it possible to have friendship with any other system than what is presented in Ayn Rand? Look at it that way. Don't ask about, oh, it's all about the individual and the selfish. Well, no. These are all service in the social capital of Gulch. It's all in service of friendship. Ask yourself, do you enjoy having friends that are always, making you feel bad because they think you're wasting your time on building that next entrepreneurship? Do you like have people around to tell you that, oh, I think it's stupid to read philosophy because it's not going to get you a job? Do you like having the people around that think, doing your own music or building your own thing is not very wise because you could get a job somewhere else? Do you like that? Do you enjoy that? Okay. Well, then maybe Ayn Rand's not wrong. Do we like being around people who use guilt as a basis for the relationship? Do we enjoy the feeling of being in a room where at any moment we know somebody may say things that obligates us to do something? Do we like being in a room where someone can suddenly say that it's a waste of time to write your own short stories or try to build a business, or that it's impractical? Do we enjoy having that possibility even in the air because people have an ethical system that makes it, they just care about you to say those sort of things? Do we enjoy that? Is that a room where you feel like you're surrounded by friends? Yes? No. If we think about her thinking in terms of friendship, we might start to see a lot more going on. And it might turn out that a lot of these ethical systems that we think point to ethical people, sure, maybe they make us legal citizens. Maybe they make us the kind of people that the state can call on to do its biddings, but does it make us friends? The other thing I ask you is simply, we've talked about the money speech. If I would hope that someone would do something for me, or that I could do something for them, how else are you going to get them to be on your side and negotiate with them if you don't have money? If you don't have some physical reality of a shared value? Maybe you say, well, actually, I've got a car I don't need. You need it. Well, it's still a shared value. In that instance, the car is a currency. It functions like money. A car, if it's the value that the other person is willing to negotiate you with, has the practical function of the dollar bill. But a lot of the times in the barter system, you simply don't have a thing available to you that the person would want. So you say, well, I have this potential that is potential value that you can then translate into whatever service you want. I ask you, how would you get people to be in? How would you get someone to come to your house and fix your water pipe if you don't have dollars? You can either develop the skill. Okay, that's great. You can do that. But there will eventually come a point where there's something that you would like done that would be good for you, that would increase value, that you don't have the ability to do yourself. And you will need someone to do it. What are you going to use? Well, if you don't have money, you'll use guilt. You'll use law. You'll use threat. You'll use the muzzle of a gun. But Ayn Rand is giving us a world where the guy who comes and fixes our pipe might also be a friend, where the guy we get our eggs from could also be someone we have a relationship with. She is precisely giving you the possibility of a world where the people that help you solve your problems are people you are also friends with, as opposed to people that you just use obligation and guilt to give you their water. Wouldn't it be nice to have a world where everyone does jobs and works for other people and feel like they're working with people that give them mutual respect? Don't we live where everyone's talking today as if they don't feel respected in their job, or they feel alienated, or different things? Well, maybe people wouldn't feel so alienated in their job if it felt like that they were the people that they were working and helping saw them as a friend, and that they felt like they could have a relationship as well. This is all possible with money. And so, as we learned from Mr. Francisco, if you want to know the state of the world, look how people treat money, and run when you hear people say that money is evil, because that is the ringing of the leopard bell that is summoning the looters for the engine of darkness that will turn the world into a snake eating its own tail. Do not be quick to be in a world where people hate money, because then when the money starts falling apart, when the world starts falling apart and you can't find money, all that's left is guilt and the muzzle of a gun. And sure, the person then may come fix your water pipes, but they won't want to be there. And do you really want to be the kind of person of whom, when others are around you, those people don't want to be there? Ayn Rand gives us a way that the people we are around are friends, and we can be a friend as well. And there's very few philosophers who have given us thought on the topic of friendship. And I think that's very important.
Very well said.
Thank you, Bethany. I've enjoyed this.
Thanks, Jacob, for gathering us.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you, Daniel. I think you make Ayn Rand proud with your rhetorical ability. And that's also something beautiful in this text. It's just the illustrious speeches that are given. And that, is something I would love for us to cultivate more. And you're certainly leading the way in that regard. So thank you both. This has been absolutely wonderful.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bethany. This has been a delight. And Jacob, thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Goofy shit like bed bars and beyond, feeling like I got some good bars going strong. From summer to spring, been a long thing, lifetimes living my dark night theology, giving birth to my inner father son prodigy. Lately I've been fucking with philosophy, but possibly my ontology, feeling more like shamanology, living through experimentality. Me and culture pilgrim, it's an odyssey. And honestly, deeply ever since I left the mountainside. The black butterfly have crawled inside my chest. He resides, flaps his wings, winks his eyes, says it's time to open my mind to darkness. History while unfolding levels of the mystery, hidden realms, poetry, soul causality, Gulch, Effie realities, counter entropic, hidden gravities. Feel at ease when you know. There's more levels than you know. Yeshua discreetly comes to meet me from the bottom of the deep sea. My psyche, the hidden key to the dream that lives in me and in you. Separation, forbidden truth, giving y'all a peek while I'm in the booth. But in the end, it's between him and you.
If we do in fact make it to Mars, that's just going to elongate the period of plausible deniability that the metaphysical is the realm we need to explore. If all humans are irrational animals as opposed to metaphysical beings, well then you're useless on Mars just as much as you are on Earth once AI is built up. So that is just going to be moving the chairs on the Titanic. That is not a true frontier. That frontier is done. I'm not saying going to Mars is a waste of time, but it's not going to be one that brings about the fullness.